At 3:14 a.m., inside Blackthorn Military Medical Center, a decorated Army colonel jolted awake from a nightmare drenched in sweat and old blood, and heard a woman's voice cut through the darkness with a 9-digit authentication code that had never been written down, never been transmitted, and was supposed to have died with every soldier who knew it. He turned. The night shift nurse was adjusting his IV drip, her back to him, humming quietly like she hadn't said anything at all. But Colonel James Harker had heard it, every syllable. And the last time those words were spoken aloud, 6 men were burning inside a downed helicopter in the mountains of a country that officially didn't exist. If this story already has its hooks in you, hit follow, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, which James Harker had decided was the particular smell of humiliation. Not the battlefield kind. He could live with that. This was the slow, grinding kind that came from lying flat on your back in a hospital bed while people younger than your career walked past your door without looking in. He'd been at Blackthorn Military Medical Center for 11 days. The injury was real. Shrapnel from an IED, poorly timed, deeply embarrassing for a man his rank, but the recovery felt punitive in a way that no military surgeon would ever admit out loud. He was 51 years old, a colonel with 30 years of service, and he was currently being turned over like a piece of deli meat by a nursing aide who had not yet introduced herself and was, based on her posture, deeply unbothered by his rank insignia framed on the nightstand. "You don't have to do that," he said, meaning the pillow rotation. "You'll thank me at 4 a.m., she said, without looking up. Her name tag said E. Voss, night shift. She had dark hair pulled back tight, hands that moved with economy rather than gentleness, and the particular brand of quiet that wasn't shyness. It was discipline. James had known enough people in his career to tell the difference. Shyness fidgeted. This woman was still in a way that took practice. He didn't think much of it that night. He thought about it significantly more at 3:14 in the morning, when the nightmare woke him and she was standing at his IV pole and said, under her breath, almost inaudible, 7 Tango November, 44 Delta. Romeo 2-1. And then kept adjusting the drip like the words had not just detonated something in his chest. He sat up too fast. The incision pulled. He didn't care. "What did you just say?" She turned. Her expression was neutral, professional, the face of someone who had been asked irrational questions by half-sedated patients many times before. "I said your drip rate was off," she said. "I corrected it." "That's not what you said." "Colonel Harker." She picked up his chart, made a notation. "It's 3 in the morning. You were having a nightmare. Your heart rate was elevated when I came in." "I know what I heard." She set the chart down, looked at him with an expression that was not quite patience and not quite pity. Something more like assessment. Then she turned off the low light by his bed, said, "Sleep well, Colonel," and walked out. He did not sleep. The thing about a 9-digit authentication code from a classified joint operation that officially never happened was that it could not exist in the memory of anyone who wasn't physically present for the mission briefing. It wasn't in any database. It wasn't in any after-action report because there was no after-action report. There was a sealed file and a list of names marked KYA and a footnote in a budget document that referred to the entire operation as a logistics anomaly. 7 Tango November 44 Delta, Romeo 2-1. That was the authentication sequence for Operation Greywire, a cross-border extraction in the Koravan mountain range, 16 months ago, that had gone catastrophically wrong in ways that James had spent the subsequent 16 months trying not to think about too carefully. 3 soldiers confirmed dead. 1 MH-60 down. A mission commander, a woman, a combat medic with the kind of file that made you question what the military's official ceiling for female operators actually was, listed as killed in action when the helicopter went down. The mission had no surviving witnesses willing to talk. James had been extracted by a second team, barely conscious, and had spent 2 weeks in a field hospital before anyone told him the final casualty numbers. By then the paperwork was already done. The file was already sealed. E. Voss knew the code. He pulled the call button at 6 a.m. and asked the floor supervisor for the night shift rotation list. The floor supervisor, a heavy-set man with a name tag that said Bridger, and the affect of someone who had been asked for things he couldn't provide many times, told him politely that patient access to staff scheduling was not standard protocol. "I'm a colonel," James said. "Yes, sir," Bridger said, with the smile of a man who had navigated military egos through a full career of healthcare administration. "You're also a patient. We don't give out staff information." So he called his aide instead, a sharp-edged captain named Lena Okafor, who had been managing his administrative existence for 2 years and who answered the phone on the second ring despite it being 6:07 a.m. "I need you to run a background on a nurse here," he said. "Name on the tag is E. Voss, night shift, Blackthorn Military Medical Center, Ward 7. A pause. "Sir, should I ask why?" "No." "Understood." Another pause, briefer. "Give me 48 hours." 24. "Sir." 24, Lena. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh. "I'll do what I can." The next night, Evos was not on his floor. He found this out by asking the day nurse, a young man named Torres who had the earnest energy of someone recently graduated and not yet disillusioned, whether the night shift rotation had changed. "Oh, Nurse Voss, she's in Ward 4 tonight, I think, covering a call-out." Torres checked his tablet. "Yeah, Ward 4 through the weekend. You need something specific? I can page her." "No," James said. "It's fine." He spent the afternoon doing what any reasonable person would do when they couldn't move around freely and needed information. He thought. He lay in the bed with the television muted, and he went back through everything he remembered about Operation Graywire, which was not everything that happened because the final hours were fragmented, blurred by blood loss and the particular dissociation that hit him when the vehicle he was riding in became something other than a vehicle. What he remembered clearly, the initial insertion had been clean. 12 personnel, a mix of special operations and intelligence support, with a combat medic attached. Major Claire Dolan, who ran her medical kit like a weapons system and had a reputation for staying calm at decibel levels that made other people run. He remembered her because she'd argued with the mission commander, a man named Colonel Garrett Sloan, about the extraction route 17 minutes before they moved out. She'd said the secondary route had signs of recent activity. Sloan had overruled her. He remembered that argument more clearly now than he used to. What happened next was the version in the official record. Enemy contact, 2 vehicles disabled, a helicopter called for emergency extraction, the helicopter going down under fire, Major Dolan listed among the casualties. James extracted on foot with 2 other survivors, picked up 4 clicks from the objective. What he had never fully examined, until right now, in this hospital bed with a television playing muted news and the smell of antiseptic doing nothing to help him think, was the small, stubborn fact that he had never actually seen the helicopter go down. He'd heard it. He'd been told. By the time he was lucid enough to ask questions, the file was sealed, and asking questions about sealed files from a field hospital bed was the kind of behavior that ended careers. He had been a colonel for 9 years. He understood, with the particular clarity that came from having made exactly this calculation himself on other people's behalf, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person could know was that something officially resolved was not actually resolved. Evos had spoken Claire Dolan's authentication code. He closed his eyes and listened to the hospital move around him and tried to remember what Claire Dolan's voice had sounded like. Lena came back in 18 hours instead of 24, which told him something about what she'd found. She appeared in his doorway at 4:30 in the afternoon, closed the door behind her, pulled a chair to the side of his bed rather than standing at the foot of it, and set a thin folder on his tray table. She didn't open it. "Her official record is clean," Lena said. "Evelyn Voss, licensed practical nurse, graduated Morrow County nursing program 9 years ago. Prior to that, nothing. No college record, no high school transcript, no Social Security activity before age 26. The licensing board has her nursing school application, but nothing before it." "That's not a gap," James said. "That's a wall." "Yes, sir." Lena folded her hands. "The nursing license is real. The work history here is real. She's been at Blackthorn for 7 years, excellent performance reviews, no incidents on record. But whoever built her background only went back as far as they needed to." A pause. I also checked whether anyone had pulled her file recently. Someone accessed her personnel record from a military intelligence node 11 days ago. 11 days ago was the day James Harker had been admitted to Blackthorn Military Medical Center. Who accessed it? The access log shows a user credential that routes back to a deactivated account in the DIA system. Someone went through a back door. Lena's voice was carefully even. Sir, I want to be direct with you. Whatever this is, it's not a standard records inquiry. Someone already knows she's here. Someone has already been looking. James picked up the folder. Inside was a photograph. A civilian DMV photo, the kind that made everyone look like a suspect. Of a woman in her early 40s, dark hair, direct gaze, expression that gave nothing away. He had seen that face before. Thinner, then. Dirtier. Under a helmet in a low-light briefing room, arguing about an extraction route. His hands were very steady, which he recognized as the same physiological response he had in the 3 seconds before a situation went completely sideways, a kind of preternatural calm that his body produced right before it understood that the ground had shifted. Pull the file on Major Claire Dolan, he said. KIA classification, Operation Greywire, and do not use your regular access credentials to do it. Lena looked at him for a moment. Sir, if I pull a sealed a file through a back channel, I'm going to have to explain that to someone eventually. Yes, he said. You will. That's a problem for later. Right now I need to know what's in it. She picked up the folder, tucked it under her arm, and left without asking any more questions. This was why he kept her. That night, Evos was back on Ward 7. He heard her before he saw her. The particular rhythm of her footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, evenly spaced, the walk of someone who covered distance efficiently rather than quickly. She checked the room across from his first. Then she came in. She moved through her checks without speaking. Vitals, IV, chart notation. She had the kind of focused silence that other night shift nurses filled with small talk about the weather or the shift rotation or whether the vending machine on the second floor had been restocked. She didn't fill it with anything. He waited until she was almost at the door. Corvin Range, he said. November, 16 months ago. She stopped. Not a flinch. Nothing that obvious. Just a cessation of movement, like a machine completing a task before acknowledging new input. You should rest, Colonel Harker. 7 Tango, November, he said. You said it. I heard it. She turned around slowly. In the low light of the room, her face was composed in a way that required more effort than it looked like it required. He could see that now. The stillness wasn't natural ease, but it was constructed, maintained. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. Yes, you do. He kept his voice level, no accusation in it, because accusation would make her defensive, and he didn't want defensive. He wanted the truth, and the truth required her to believe he wasn't a threat. I'm not here to expose you. I don't know yet what's happening or why you're here, but I know who you are, and I think you know what I almost died for. A long silence. Outside, somewhere on the floor, a monitor alarm beeped twice and then was silenced. You should be careful, she said finally, about what you think you know. I'm being careful, he said. I'm being very careful. I'm asking instead of reporting. She looked at him for another moment, weighing something, running a calculation he couldn't read. And then she said, Get some sleep, Colonel, and walked out, and this time he couldn't tell whether he'd gotten anywhere or not. Well, 2 mornings later, Lena called him from a number he didn't recognize. The sealed file on Major Claire Dolan, she said without preamble. KIA, classification, Greywire. It's been accessed 6 times in the past 8 months, not by anyone from the original mission clearance list, by a security consulting firm, Harrow Strategic Group, private contractor, DoD adjacent, contracts with several defense acquisition programs. A pause. Sir, Harrow Strategic Group's primary client list includes 3 officials from the Joint Acquisition Office that funded Operation Greywire. James was quiet for a moment. Who's running Harrow? A man named Victor Pren, retired 2-star. He was... Lena stopped. When she continued, her voice had dropped slightly. He was the theater commander for the Corvin operation. He retired 8 months after Graywire. Pension, commendations, consulting contract with DoD within 6 months. Victor Pren. James knew the name the way you knew a door you'd walk through without knowing what was on the other side. You recognized it when someone told you to look at it differently. Pren had authorized the mission parameters. Pren had approved Sloan as mission commander. Pren had been the one who, in the brief after-action summary James had been allowed to read from his field hospital bed, signed off on the KYA classifications and the sealed file recommendation. "I need you to do something without asking me why," James said. "That's becoming a theme, sir. I need you to find out whether Harrow Strategic Group has had any personnel or contractors in this building, any security consultants, embedded advisors, anything that would put one of their people physically inside Blackthorn Military Medical Center in the past 30 days. A silence that lasted long enough for him to know she was thinking rather than just complying. "Sir," she said carefully, "if what you're telling me is what I think you're telling me, you might want to consider whether making inquiries from a room in that building is—" "I know," he said. "I know exactly what I'm doing." He didn't. But he was starting to understand the shape of it, which was something. That night, E. Voss came in at 3 a.m. and found him sitting up in bed with the lights on, looking at the door. She stopped in the doorway. "You've been making calls," she said. "Yes." "From this room?" "Yes." She came in and closed the door behind her. Not all the way. A nurse closing a patient's door entirely at 3 in the morning was a violation of protocol that would be noticed. She pushed it to within an inch of the frame and then stood with her back to it, and for the first time since he'd seen her, the careful neutrality in her face was gone. What was underneath it wasn't fear. It was something more complicated, a controlled urgency, the expression of someone who had been maintaining a very specific situation for a very long time and had just watched a variable enter the equation that she hadn't planned for. "You need to stop," she said quietly. "Whatever you've been pulling on your end, the file access, the contractor search, you need to stop. Right now." "I'm not going to stop." "You don't understand what you're poking at. Then explain it to me." "I can't." "You can." He didn't raise his voice. "You're Claire Dolan. You didn't die in the Corvin range. You built a new identity, you got a nursing license, and you've been in this hospital for 7 years. And someone has already been watching your file. Someone from Harrow Strategic Group, which is run by Victor Pren, who was your theater commander on Graywire." He paused. "If I've connected those dots in 48 hours, they've already connected them too. So whatever you're protecting by staying quiet, it's not yourself." She was very still. "It's the others," he said. "The survivors." Something moved across her face, fast and involuntary, and he knew he was right. "There are 3 more," she said, and her voice was different now. Stripped of the professional register, just a voice. "People who were on that operation. People who know what actually happened that night. I've spent 7 years making sure anyone looking for them would find a wall." "Pren is looking." "Pren has been looking for 8 months," she said. "He's getting closer. When you started pulling files—" She stopped, breathed. "There's a monitoring algorithm on the sealed Graywire file. Anything that touches it triggers a flag in a system I don't have access to. You just lit a signal fire." James felt the shift in the room. Not metaphorically, but the actual physiological sensation of a situation changing state, the way air pressure dropped before something loud. "How long do we have?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, making a decision he could see the weight of. "I don't know," she said, "but I don't think it's long." Outside in the corridor, 2 floors down, the hospital's main entrance registered the arrival of a black SUV that had not been there an hour ago. The security camera footage would later show 3 men in civilian clothes who signed in as equipment contractors, took the service elevator to the 4th floor, and did not appear on the exit log. No one noticed because no one was watching for it yet. But Claire Dolan, Evelyn Voss, stood at the door of room 714 with her hand resting at her side in a posture that was not a nurse's posture and she was already listening to something James Harker couldn't hear, and her eyes had the particular quality of a person doing threat assessment in real time. "You said you weren't going to expose me," she said, not looking at him. "I said I wasn't here to expose you." "Then here's what you need to understand." She turned. Her voice was low and absolutely steady. What happened in the Caravan Range wasn't a mission failure. It wasn't an ambush. Every detail of what went wrong that night, every casualty, every decision, was constructed in advance by people who needed the operation to fail in exactly that way. She looked at him with the kind of directness that didn't ask for anything back. "They tried to kill everyone who knew that. I made it out. I have been carrying the proof for 14 years, and the only reason I am standing in this room instead of inside a sealed file myself is because I was very careful. And now I've made you not careful," he said. "Now," she said, "we have a different problem." Somewhere in the building, a door opened that shouldn't have. She heard it before he did. She moved before he could ask what she'd heard. Not the way nurses moved, not the efficient, purposeful glide of someone managing a floor, but low and fast, crossing to the window in 2 steps and angling herself against the wall beside it rather than in front of it. And the difference between those 2 positions was the difference between someone checking the view and someone who didn't want to be visible from outside. James watched her do it and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where things went sideways, that the woman standing against his hospital room wall had done this before, not as a drill, not as training, as a thing that had actually been necessary more than once. "How many entrances does this floor have?" she asked, without looking at him. "I don't know. I came in through the ER. Stairwell at the east end, stairwell at the west, service elevator near the nurses' station." She said it like she was reading from something she'd memorized a long time ago. "The service elevator requires a key card after 10 p.m. The east stairwell has a broken latch on the second-floor landing. Maintenance submitted a work order 6 weeks ago, and it hasn't been fixed." A pause, still not looking at him. Someone who knew that would use the east stairwell. "You've been mapping this building." "I've been working in this building for 7 years. She finally looked at him. "I've been mapping every building I've been in for 14. He believed her. The specificity of it, the broken latch, the work order, the timeline, was not the kind of detail someone invented in the moment. It was the kind of detail that lived in the back of a person's mind because they'd decided at some point that the difference between knowing it and not knowing it was the difference between going home and not going home. "We need to move you," she said. "I have a surgical incision that's 11 days old." "I know what you have." Her voice wasn't impatient, but it wasn't gentle either. "Can you walk?" He'd been walking the corridor twice a day for the past 4 days, holding the IV pole, watched by Torres and whoever else happened to be at the nurses' station. His range was limited. His stamina was not what it had been. But the honest answer to her question was yes. "Yes," he said. "Then we're not moving yet. Not until I know exactly what I'm hearing." She held up one hand, not at him, just a gesture of calibration, and stood very still for a moment. James did the same. The hospital at 3 a.m. was not silent, but it had a texture, a specific ambient noise that stayed consistent. The HVAC cycling, a monitor somewhere down the hall, the occasional footstep of the overnight staff. What Claire was listening for was something that didn't fit that texture. He heard it about 4 seconds after she did. 2 floors down, maybe less. A sound that didn't belong. Not loud, not dramatic, just the particular acoustics of a stairwell door that had been opened and held rather than allowed to swing shut on its own. Someone controlling the noise. Someone who'd been in a building they weren't supposed to be in before and knew what sounds to manage. "Okay," Claire said in a voice that was almost no voice at all. "Get dressed." She was out of the room before he'd finished pulling on his boots, and back in 90 seconds, carrying a hospital bag that had clearly not been his. It was a duffel that materialized from somewhere he didn't ask about, stocked with things that told a story about how long she'd been preparing for exactly this. A change of clothes, civilian, folded, a burner phone, powered down, a plastic case the size of a hardback book that she tucked under her arm and did not explain. She'd also changed. She was still in scrubs, but she'd added something underneath. He could see the line of it at her collar, a dark compression layer, and she'd pulled her hair back tighter than it had been. It was a small change, but it wasn't about comfort. It was about range of motion. "The case," he said, nodding at what she was carrying. "Drive," she said. 14 years of documentation on gray wire. Everything I pulled out of the network before I disappeared. Everything I've collected since." She looked at him steadily. "This is why they're here. Not you. You're just the thing that told them where to look." That landed the way she probably intended it to. He'd been the signal fire. He'd pulled the files, triggered the monitoring algorithm, and lit a path straight to a woman who had spent 14 years making sure there was no path. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant most things recently. "Don't be useful with that energy yet," she said. "Be useful later. Right now, move." They went into the corridor. The ward was quiet, the overnight lighting reduced to a pale amber that turned everything slightly jaundiced. 2 rooms down, a patient was asleep with the television on, volume low, casting blue-white flickers under the door. At the nurse's station, the overnight charge nurse, a small, methodical woman named Patel, who had been on Ward 7 longer than Claire, was working through charting with her back to the corridor. Claire moved them past the station in the blind spot created by the medication cart parked at the station's corner, which James suspected had not been parked there by accident. She took them toward the west stairwell, not the east, which was closer, which had the broken latch. "Aren't we going down?" he asked, as quietly as he could manage while still moving. "Not yet." She pushed the stairwell door open with her shoulder rather than her hand, keeping her palm free, and held it for him. "We're going up." The stairwell was colder than the ward, the kind of institutional cold that suggested the HVAC served the building's operational areas first, and the stairwells as an afterthought. Their footsteps were audible no matter how carefully they moved. Concrete staircases didn't reward stealth. They punished it. Claire took them up 1 floor and stopped at the landing, listening. From somewhere below, not the floor they'd come from, but below that, James heard voices. Not words, just the cadence of people communicating in the clipped, efficient shorthand of people with a task. 2 voices, maybe 3. "Service elevator?" Claire said, barely audible. "They're splitting." "Splitting means more than 2 people. I counted 3 coming in. There could be more staged outside." She was already moving again, up the next flight. "The roof has a maintenance access point that connects to the adjacent building via a utility bridge. Blackthorn was built connected to the parking structure. Same owners, same construction phase. The bridge is supposed to be locked, but the lock was replaced with a non-standard mechanism after a repair in 2019, and the replacement doesn't actually engage." He didn't ask how she knew. He followed her up. The roof door opened onto a flat expanse of ventilation units and cable conduit. The city spread out below them in the particular orange-gray of a night that was ambient with light, but not actually lit. The air was sharp. James's incision had been complaining for the past 3 flights of stairs, and was now registering its formal objection, a pulling heat that wasn't yet pain but was making promises. Claire crossed the roof without hesitating, navigating between the equipment housings by memory or close to it, moving toward the north edge where a low structure a utility bridge, exactly as she'd described, a metal walkway with chain-link sides connecting the hospital's roof line to the adjacent parking structure, extended across the gap. The lock was a standard padlock shape, but when she pressed the release mechanism with the heel of her palm in a specific place, it clicked open in a way that a standard padlock wouldn't. "You've used this before," James said. "Twice," she said. "Drills. I never actually needed it until tonight." She pulled the bridge gate open and looked at him. "The parking structure has a stairwell on the north side. We go down, we get to the ground level, we get out of the immediate perimeter. And then? Then we find out how much they already know and how many people they brought." The bridge was narrower than it looked from the roof, maybe 4 feet wide, chain-link walls rising to chest height, the metal grating of the floor making a sound under their feet that James couldn't do much about. Below them was the drop between the 2 buildings, a service alley, a dumpster, a sodium light that turned the concrete below a flat, ugly yellow. He focused on the far end of the bridge and kept moving. They were halfway across when Claire stopped. She stopped so abruptly that James almost walked into her, caught himself on the chain link wall, felt the metal vibrate under his hands. Below them, in the service alley, a man was standing with his back to the building wall, arms folded, watching the hospital's east entrance. Dark jacket, dark pants, the posture of someone positioned rather than waiting. He hadn't looked up. "Perimeter," Claire said, below a whisper. James looked past her and counted the sight lines. The man in the alley covered the east. From here he couldn't see the south and west, but if this operation had any planning behind it, and it did, because Harrow's strategic group had planning behind it, those were covered too. "We have a problem with the ground floor exit strategy," he said. "I know." She was already moving again faster to the far end of the bridge. Change of plan. The parking structure's rooftop was mostly empty at 3 a.m. A few cars belonging to night shift workers, a maintenance vehicle, the ambient smell of exhaust and oil that came from a structure that absorbed car fumes the way walls absorbed sound. Claire moved to the north stairwell, pushed through the door, and took them down 2 flights to the 3rd level. Here she stopped and pulled out the burner phone, powered it on, and waited the 15 seconds for it to initialize. She dialed a number from memory. It rang 4 times. A voice answered. Male, sleep-blurred, alert within the first half-second. "Yeah. It's moving," she said. "I need the Millward Street option." A silence that lasted almost exactly 3 seconds. "How many?" 3 confirmed inside, at least 1 on the perimeter. Could be more." Another silence. "Give me 20 minutes." "You have 50... She hung up and looked at James, who had been standing close enough to hear both sides of a conversation he had a lot of questions about. "One of the survivors," he said. "The one I trust with logistics." She put the phone in her jacket pocket. "His name doesn't matter right now. What matters is he has a vehicle 2 blocks from here, and a route out of the city that doesn't use any road with a camera that's registered to anything they can pull in under an hour. You've had contingency plans." "I've had contingency plans for contingency plans," she said, without any particular pride in it. "That's what 14 years of being not dead looks like." He almost said something about that, about what it cost, maintaining that level of readiness for that long, the specific exhaustion of it. But she was already moving again, and this wasn't the moment, and he got the impression she wouldn't have wanted him to comment on it anyway. They made it to the ground level of the parking structure through the north stairwell and came out into a section of the garage that connected to a surface lot behind a medical office building, which in turn had an exit onto a side street that ran parallel to but did not intersect with the service alley where the perimeter man was standing. It wasn't clean. They moved through a gap in a chain-link fence that had been cut at some point and bent back to look intact, which was not Claire's preparation but someone else's. And James made a note that there were people in this city who had cut that fence for reasons that may or may not have aligned with his current interests. The side street was empty. The night air was colder out here than on the roof, a damp cold that worked its way in. James's incision had moved from promises to delivery. He didn't say anything about it because there was nothing useful to say. 12 minutes after Claire's call, a silver 4-door with a dented rear quarter panel came around the corner and stopped. The driver was a man who looked like he was in his mid-40s, heavy-set, with the face of someone who had been operating on insufficient sleep for so long that it had become his baseline. He had no expression when they got in. Not surprise, not relief, not anything. Just the assessment of a man checking that the right people were in his car. "Harker," he said, looking at James in the rearview mirror. Not a greeting. An identification. "He knows who you are," Claire said to James from the passenger seat. "He knows who most people connected to Greywire are. It's part of how I've kept track." "Who are you?" James asked the driver. "Marcus Webb," the man said, pulling out onto the street. "Staff sergeant, retired. I was on the security element for Greywire. I drove one of the vehicles that took fire." A pause as he turned onto a main road without signaling, moving into the flow of the sparse late-night traffic. "I went home after the extraction, filed my reports, got out of the service a year later when my contract was up." Another pause. "Got a visit from 2 men in civilian clothes about 18 months after that. They told me the official record was complete and accurate, and that if I had any recollection that contradicted it, I should discuss it with them before discussing it with anyone else." "What did you tell them?" James said. "Told them I had no recollections worth discussing." Marcus's voice was dry, factual, the voice of a man who had made a specific calculation and was comfortable with it. Then I called Claire. James looked at the back of Claire's head. The city moved past the windows, streetlights, and empty intersections and the occasional lit window in an apartment building where someone was awake for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. "The visit you got," he said to Marcus. "Who sent those men?" Credentials said DOD security, but the visit was arranged through a contact from Harrow Strategic Group. I didn't know the name then, but I found it later. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. Victor Pren doesn't leave gaps. He's been managing the perimeter of this for a long time. The difference now is that someone started pulling the file, and he decided managing wasn't enough anymore. "That was me," James said. "I started pulling the file." Marcus nodded once. "Yeah. Claire called me 3 hours ago and told me. I figured you'd show up in my car eventually." He didn't sound resentful exactly, but there was something in the flatness of his tone that suggested he'd had a life. A functional, if constrained, life, and that James Harker's file pulling had complicated it in ways that were not entirely welcome. "I'm sorry," James said again. "Don't be sorry. Be useful." Marcus said it the same way Claire had, and James realized they'd probably had this conversation in various forms for years. Don't perform contrition. Do something with it. "What's the evidence drive contain?" James asked Claire. She half turned from the passenger seat. "Everything. Communications intercepts from the 48 hours before the mission, showing that the extraction route Garrett Sloan chose was the route that had been pre-selected. Not by tactical necessity, but by someone in the command chain who needed the mission to fail at a specific point. Financial records showing the weapons network Graywire was supposed to disrupt was actually a network that 3 DoD contractors and 2 senior officials were profiting from. And the confirmation, sourced from an internal Harrow document I accessed remotely 4 years ago, that Victor Pren authorized the targeting parameters that put our unit in the kill zone. The car was very quiet for a moment. "He tried to kill his own people," James said. "He tried to kill the people who could prove he was selling access to a classified weapons network," Claire said. "We weren't his people. We were a liability." She turned back to face the road. "That's the distinction he made. I've been living inside that distinction for 14 years. Marcus drove. The city thinned around them as they moved toward the outer edge, the commercial blocks giving way to quieter streets, and then to the approach ramps for a highway that would take them north. James sat in the back seat and felt the specific weight of what he was carrying. Not the physical injury, though that was also making its presence known, but the weight of a thing understood. He had spent 16 months not looking directly at what had happened in the Kuravan Range, and now he was looking at it, and it was the shape he'd been afraid it was. "We need to get the drive to federal investigators," he said. "Not military intelligence. Civilian federal, FBI, or the Inspector General's office. Somewhere Pren doesn't have contacts." "I know," Claire said. "Do you have contacts there?" "I have one. Someone I've been in contact with for 2 years, carefully, through channels that don't touch anything Harrow monitors." She paused. "The problem is getting to them with the drive intact and both of us not arrested on whatever pretext Pren's people manufacture to justify the intercept. If they intercept us, the pretext becomes academic." "Yes." Marcus slowed for a traffic light, and the car sat in the red glow for a long moment. "There's something else," Claire said, and her voice had shifted. Not softer, but more deliberate. The voice of someone choosing words with the specific care of a person who had been carrying a thing for a long time and was finally setting it down. "The mission commander, Garrett Sloan. He died in the Kuravan Mountains," James said. "Listed KYA, same as you." "No." Claire looked at the windshield. The light changed. Marcus drove. "Sloan walked out of those mountains. He had an arrangement with Pren. He takes the fall publicly, gets buried in the KYA list, and surfaces elsewhere under a different clearance level working directly for Harrow." A pause. "He's been inside the contractor network for 14 years. He's the one who identified the monitoring flag on the Graywire file. He's the one who sent the team to the hospital tonight." James processed that for a moment. "He was there," he said. "In the hospital. Not personally, but the team answers to him. Claire finally looked at him, over her shoulder, and her face in the passing light was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Garrett Sloan is the reason I've never been able to go to federal investigators directly. Every contact I've tried to build, he's been a step ahead. He knows how I think. He was my commanding officer for 2 years. Marcus took an exit ramp. They were in the outer city now, light industry and dark storefronts, and the particular anonymity of places that operated on schedules separate from the rest of the world. He pulled into a lot behind a self-storage facility, killed the headlights, and cut the engine. "We'll stay here until I hear from the secondary contact," Marcus said. 3 hours, maybe 4. James sat in the dark car with his incision complaining and the drive's existence somewhere in Claire's possession, and 14 years of buried truth reconfiguring itself into something that had an immediate, concrete shape. Victor Pren had sent a team. Garrett Sloan was alive and working against them. They had evidence that could destroy both of them, and they were sitting in a parking lot at 4 in the morning with no clear path to the one federal contact who might be able to receive it. He thought about Lena Okafor, who had pulled files for him on insufficient sleep, and had told him, gently and professionally, that he might want to consider whether making inquiries from inside the building was wise. He should call her. He was reaching for the burner phone to ask Claire if he could use it when her phone buzzed instead. Not a call, a text, single line, and she looked at it and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus." Her voice was the voice of someone who had just received information that changed the calculation in a specific and unwelcome direction. "The secondary contact," she said. "He's not responding. His check-in signal dropped 40 minutes ago." Marcus turned in the driver's seat to look at her. "There's only one reason Doran's signal drops," he said. "I know." "If they have Doran, they have his contact list." "I know." She was already looking at the windows of the car, the lot, the fencing, the approach road, doing the math on what it meant if Garrett Sloan's people had found their logistics contact before they'd found Claire, which meant the net they were in was tighter than it had looked 3 minutes ago. "We need to move again." "To where?" Marcus asked. Claire looked at the drive in her hands. It was a question she didn't answer immediately, and the fact that she didn't answer it immediately was the first time James had seen her not have a ready response, which told him more about the severity of their situation than anything else that had happened since 3 a.m. Outside, somewhere on the access road that ran alongside the storage facility, a set of headlights turned in and moved slowly toward the lot, and Marcus said very quietly, "Company," and reached under his seat for something James didn't ask him to describe. The headlights moved slowly, which was worse than if they'd moved fast. Fast meant urgency, reaction, something improvised. Slow meant someone who already knew where they were going and wasn't in a hurry about it because they didn't need to be. Marcus had his hand under the seat. Claire had already unbuckled and shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, one hand on the door handle, the other holding the drive against her side. James did the math on what he could contribute to the next 60 seconds. One functioning adult with an 11-day-old surgical incision and no weapon, and arrived at an honest answer, which was not much physically. What he had was his access codes, his rank, and his phone. He pulled the burner from his pocket and powered it on. "What are you doing?" Claire said. "Calling Lena Okafor. She has clearance to reach the Joint Chief's duty officer. If I can get a verified call into military command chain before they take the drive. If you call from that phone right now, they'll have a location ping in under 4 minutes." "We need them to have our location," James said. "We need people who aren't Pren's people to know exactly where we are." A pause. The headlights were 40 meters away and still coming. "Make it fast," Claire said. He dialed. Lena picked up on the second ring. Again. "Sir?" "Lena, I need you to call the Joint Chief's duty officer right now and tell them Colonel James Harker is being held under duress at the Millward Self-Storage Facility, north end of the city, by contractors affiliated with Harrow Strategic Group. Tell them this is a matter of national security and that there is classified evidence related to Operation Greywire in our possession. Use my authorization code, Echo 7 Foxtrot, November 33. Read that back." She read it back, her voice perfectly steady, the voice of a woman who had processed unusual requests before and understood that now was not the time to seek context. "Done," she said. "Sir, are you—" He hung up. The headlights stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the car's engine cut off, and one door opened and a figure got out. Alone, hands visible, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone trying to project non-threat. The parking lot's single security light caught enough to show a man in his 50s, military build going soft at the edges, a face that James didn't recognize, but Claire clearly did, because the sound she made was involuntary and almost inaudible, and nothing like the controlled professional he'd watched navigate the past 2 hours. "That's Sloan," she said. Garrett Sloan walked to within 10 feet of their car and stopped. He didn't reach for anything. He stood with his hands at his sides in the posture of a man who had decided that looking like a threat was less useful than looking like a negotiation. He was average height, thick through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular weathered quality of a face that had spent time outdoors in difficult conditions and not bothered to protect itself from any of it. He looked like 100 senior enlisted men James had known, the kind of face that inspired a specific, wrongly placed confidence. "Claire," he said, not loudly. The lot was quiet enough that he didn't need volume. She had the door open. She was out of the car before Marcus could say anything, standing 6 feet from Sloan with her arms loose at her sides and her posture communicating things James could read even from the back seat. "You killed 3 people in those mountains," she said. "I followed orders." "Your orders came from the people you were selling the network to." Sloan's expression didn't shift. "You have a drive that contains materials obtained through unauthorized network access across 2 classified systems. Anything on it is inadmissible, seized, and potentially a federal offense against the person who holds it." He glanced at the car, at James through the windshield. "Colonel Harker, you've had a difficult recovery. It's not unusual for patients to experience disorientation, paranoid ideation." "Stop," James said. He'd gotten out of the car during the speech, which had cost him, the incision pulling hard as he straightened. He stood next to Claire. "Don't do that. I'm trying to offer you both a resolution that doesn't require anyone else to get hurt." "Your people already killed Doran," Claire said. Something moved across Sloan's face. Not guilt, but calculation, an acknowledgement that the variable had been identified. "That was unfortunate." "He had a daughter," she said. "She's 11. "Claire," his voice shifted, the negotiating register dropping into something more direct. "You've been running for 14 years. I know how tired that is. I know what it costs." A pause. "Give me the drive. Walk away. I can make the Voss identity permanent, locked, protected, backed by resources you don't have access to right now. You disappear properly this time. No more looking over your shoulder." "And Harker?" Sloan looked at James. "Colonel Harker had a medical episode. He's been found safe." "And Marcus?" A silence, which was its own answer. Claire moved in the half-second of that silence, and James registered it before he fully understood what he was seeing. She wasn't running, wasn't reaching for anything. She was stepping left and putting herself between Sloan and the car, and her voice came out level and absolutely deliberate. "Marcus, drive." What happened next was compressed into a timeline that James's memory would later struggle to sequence correctly. Marcus started the car. Sloan moved, not toward Claire but sideways toward his own vehicle, and James understood a half-beat later that Sloan hadn't come alone, that the negotiation had been a positioning exercise, that the car behind Sloan had 2 more people in it who had been waiting for the moment when everyone's attention was on the conversation. Claire saw it first. She was already moving when the second car's doors opened, and what she did next was not what nurses did. She closed the distance to the first man out of the second vehicle at a speed that the situation didn't leave him time to respond to, and the engagement was brief and efficient, and James would not have been able to describe the specific mechanics of it if someone had asked him later, only that it lasted less than 4 seconds, and the man was on the ground, and she had what had been in his hand, which was a taser, not a firearm, which told James they wanted the drive intact and the people carrying it functional enough to be interrogated. The second man out of the car was faster and had more distance. James stepped into his path, the only contribution available to him, and took the man's momentum into his shoulder rather than letting him pass, which was effective in that it stopped the man, and ineffective in that James's incision registered the impact as a system-wide emergency. He didn't go down. He wanted to go down. He stayed upright by sheer determination, and the man hit the pavement instead, tripped by the collision and James's weight going into him rather than away. Marcus had the car moving. Claire grabbed James's arm, not gently, and they were through the passenger door and the car was accelerating before the door fully closed. In the side mirror, James saw Sloane standing in the lot watching them go. Not running, not calling anything in, just watching, with an expression that even at distance and in poor light communicated something specific. Not defeat, adjustment. "He let us go," James said. "He let us go," Claire confirmed, her breathing elevated but controlled, checking the taser she'd taken and then putting it in the glove compartment. "He's repositioning." "For what?" "For whatever comes next." She looked at the road ahead. "He doesn't need us contained. He needs the drive, and he's betting we're going to try to move it through a channel he already knows about. The federal contact. Whoever I have left." She pulled out the burner phone and stared at it. Marcus drove fast but not recklessly, working through streets James didn't know, navigating by something. Memory, preparation, the same kind of exhaustive contingency mapping that had put the cut fence in the right place. Doran was my logistics. He had one contact in the FBI field office, a woman named Reyes, Supervisory Special Agent, Public Corruption Unit. I've never spoken to her directly. Everything went through Doran. "Then we can't trust that channel," Marcus said. "We can't trust any channel through Doran. If they have his devices..." "Then Reyes is burned," James said. "Potentially. Or she's being monitored." Claire pressed her palm flat against the dashboard. Not a gesture of despair, more like a person physically resetting, pressing the anxiety out through her hand. "I need a channel that doesn't touch anything Sloane can monitor, something entirely outside the network he's been managing." James thought about what he had. His own military contacts were a liability. Any channel that went through DoD ran the risk of intersecting with Pren's influence, which had been operating in that system for 14 years. Lena had already called the Joint Chiefs duty officer, which was the right move but not a fast move. Duty officers logged calls, escalated through channels, and the process took hours that they may not have. "What I have," he said slowly, "is a senator." Claire looked at him. "Raymond Vick, Senate Armed Services Committee. He's been trying to open an inquiry into the Harrow Strategic Group's DoD contracts for 8 months, publicly, on record, in subcommittee. He can't get traction because the DoD won't release the contract details." James met her eyes. "He doesn't need the DoD to release the contract details if we give him the drive." Marcus said, "A senator's office has staff and phones and people who talk. A senator also has staff counsel, secure communication channels, and the legal authority to receive classified materials as part of an active oversight function without those materials passing through DoD channels first." James kept his voice level. "It's not clean, but it's outside the network Sloane is watching." A silence in the car. "How do you reach him directly?" Claire asked. "His personal aide. I know her. We overlapped at the War College in 2009. She was there as a congressional fellow." He paused. "I don't know if she'll pick up a call from a number she doesn't recognize at 4 in the morning." "Try," Claire said. And she picked up on the 5th ring, voice thick with sleep but sharpening quickly. "Marissa Buell." "Marissa, James Harker. I need you to call Senator Vick right now and tell him I have the documentation he's been looking for on Harrow Strategic Group. All of it. Original source materials. I need a secure receiving location in the next 2 hours." A silence on the line. He could hear her waking fully into the call, the sleep clearing out of her voice in real time. "Colonel Harker," she said, "is this line secure?" "No, which is why I need you to move quickly and not discuss details. Can you reach him?" "Yes." "Marissa, there are people who do not want this material to reach the senator. You need to assume that anyone who contacts you about this call, before I am physically in front of you, is working against us. Anyone." Another silence, then, "Understood. I'll call you back on this number within 15 minutes. "Make it 10. He hung up. The city moved outside the windows. Marcus had taken them onto a highway approach and then off it again almost immediately, a loop that served no navigation purpose except to make them harder to follow if anything was on them. James watched the side mirror. Nothing consistent. Either they were clean or the tail was good enough to stay out of the mirror, and he couldn't do much about which of those it was. Claire had been watching him during the call. "Senator Vick's inquiry," she said. "How much does he actually know?" "He knows the contracts don't add up. He knows Harrow got preferential access in multiple acquisition cycles. He doesn't know about Graywire. He doesn't know about Pren's direct involvement." James paused. "He's going to find out all of it in approximately 2 hours. The people Pren has inside the DoD will move to discredit the evidence the moment it surfaces. They'll claim chain of custody violations, unauthorized access, which is why I need to be in front of the committee as a witness before they have time to build that argument. A colonel with 30 years of service and a current active duty status, presenting evidence under oath, is harder to dismiss than a file delivered anonymously." He looked at his hands. "They'll still try. But there's a difference between trying to bury a file and trying to discredit a colonel on record in a Senate oversight proceeding." Claire was quiet for a moment. "You're putting yourself in the middle of this," she said. "I'm already in the middle of it. I mean publicly, on record. That's not the same as pulling files from a hospital bed. I know what it means." He met her eyes. "I know what happened on that mountain. I know what was done to the people on that operation, and I know that I walked away from a sealed file for 16 months because it was easier than not walking away." He stopped. "That's done." She held his gaze for a moment, reading something there that she apparently found acceptable, because she turned back to the road without arguing. The burner phone buzzed at 9 minutes. Marissa Buell's voice was fully alert and careful. "Senator Vick can receive you at his field office, 4400 Brennan Avenue. It's a congressional district office, not the main location. There will be staff counsel present and a secure document intake process." "Are you sure about counsel?" James said. "Anyone who—" "The counsel is Patricia Lowe. She's been working the Harrow inquiry for 6 months. The senator trusts her entirely, and so do I." A pause. "How many people are coming?" "3. One of them needs medical attention." It wasn't a question. He glanced down at his side where the incision had communicated its condition comprehensively enough that it was now showing through his shirt in a way that was becoming difficult to ignore. "One of them will manage," he said. "I'll have a first aid kit," Marissa said flatly. 4400 Brennan, 40 minutes. My turn. They made it in 38. The field office was in a commercial building, ground floor, the kind of congressional presence that was designed to be accessible rather than impressive. A waiting area with folding chairs and American flags, staff desks, the accumulated paper of a functioning office. Marissa Buell met them at the side entrance, a compact woman in her early 40s with the alert efficiency of someone who had been in Washington long enough to know that crises arrived at inconvenient hours and needed to be processed regardless. She took one look at James and said, "Sit down," and went for the first aid kit before anyone had been introduced. Senator Raymond Vick was in the inner office with Patricia Lowe, who had the tight-wound energy of a litigator who had been handed a case she'd been building toward for months and was now trying not to show how hard she wanted to run with it. Vick himself was a tall man in his 60s, the kind of senator who had been in office long enough to stop performing authority because he no longer needed to. He just had it, sitting in a chair in a congressional field office at 4:40 a.m. Like this was a perfectly ordinary situation. "Colonel Harker," he said, "walk me through what you have." While Marissa cleaned and redressed James's incision with the grim efficiency of someone who had apparently done field medicine at some point, he didn't ask, Claire laid the drive on the conference table, connected it to the counsel's laptop with an adapter Marcus produced from somewhere, and began walking through the documentation. It took 41 minutes. Patricia Lowe didn't speak during the presentation. She made notes in a legal pad in handwriting so small it was almost coded, her eyes moving between the screen and Claire's face, and James watched her absorb the scale of what she was looking at. Not just a contractor irregularity, not just a financial impropriety, but a chain of decisions that had resulted in the deliberate targeting of American service members, 14 years of active suppression of that truth, and an ongoing private security operation that had put a team inside a military hospital 12 hours ago. When Claire finished, Lowe set down her pen. "How did you get the Harrow internal document?" she said. "Remote access to a system they didn't know I knew about," Claire said. 4 years ago. I can detail the method, but it was a vulnerability that's since been patched. So the document is real, but the access was unauthorized. Yes. The communications intercepts from before the mission? Pulled from the tactical network during the 48 hours immediately following the operation before the system was scrubbed. I had legitimate access at the time. And the financial records? Sourced from a clear Defense Department analyst who provided them to me voluntarily in 2016 before he died of a cardiac event that I have always believed was not a cardiac event. Claire said it without inflection. His name was Thomas Aldis. He's in the documentation. Lowe looked at Vic. Something passed between them that didn't require words. The Aldis' death, Vic said. That's a separate investigation. Everything in that drive is a separate investigation, Claire said. That's the problem. It's all separate until you put it together, and the people who needed it to stay separate have been very good at keeping it that way. Lowe picked up her pen again. I'm going to need... The office's front door opened. Not violently, not dramatically. Just the ordinary sound of a door and Marissa's voice in the outer office saying something tightly controlled, and then a man's voice answering her that James recognized without needing to see the face, because Garrett Sloan had a particular register. Calm, reasonable, the voice of someone who was absolutely certain he was the authority in any room he entered. Claire was on her feet before anyone else processed what was happening. He followed us here, Marcus said, from the doorway of the inner office. He didn't follow us, Claire said, and her voice had the flat precision of someone arriving at a conclusion through logic rather than emotion. He knew. He knew about Vic's inquiry. He's been monitoring it. She looked at the drive still connected to the laptop. If he takes this now? He won't take it, Vic said, standing. The senator had 30 years in office, and whatever else that had cost him, it had not cost him his nerve. This is a congressional facility, and he is not authorized to... He doesn't care, James said. The outer door opened wider, and Sloan came into the inner office with 2 people behind him, and James noticed in the compressed second of processing that the 2 people behind him were not Harrow contractors. They were military, current military, in service dress, one of them wearing the rank of a brigadier general. Not Pren's people, someone else's. The brigadier general stepped forward. Colonel Harker, I'm Brigadier General Susan Farrell, Inspector General's office. We received a duty officer report approximately 90 minutes ago regarding your situation. She looked at Sloan, who was standing very still. Mr. Sloan was detained at the perimeter and accompanied us inside. He is not here voluntarily. James looked at Sloan. For the first time since the parking lot, Sloan's expression had changed. The calculation in it was still there, but underneath it something had shifted. The specific quality of a man who had been operating with a structural advantage for a very long time and had just felt it alter. The duty officer called, James said. Farrell nodded. Captain Okafor's report triggered an immediate IG flag, given Harrow Strategic Group is currently under a separate investigation that we are not able to discuss in detail. She paused. However, I can tell you that what is in this room tonight is now within the scope of that investigation. Claire stood at the table with the drive in her hand and the documentation on the screen behind her, and 14 years of being not dead, arranged in a form that could finally be looked at directly, and James watched her face do something complicated. Not relief, because relief implied that the threat was over and nothing was over, but something closer to the first moment of solid ground after a very long time without it. Sloan said, Whatever you think you have, Mr. Sloan, General Farrell said, and her voice was the voice of someone who did not need to raise it. You will be given the opportunity to respond to specific inquiries at the appropriate time. That time is not right now. Sloan closed his mouth. It was a small thing, a man stopping talking because someone with authority told him to. It should not have carried the weight that it carried. But Claire had spent 14 years watching Sloan operate without anyone with authority telling him to stop. And James saw on her face exactly what that moment cost and what it returned. The The laptop screen behind her displayed Thomas Aldis's financial documentation. The drive sat in her hand. Outside, the eastern sky was beginning to differentiate from the darkness. Not light yet, but the suggestion of it, the first incremental shift that preceded everything else. Then Farrell's phone rang. She answered it, listened for approximately 10 seconds, and her expression changed in a way that was disciplined but not entirely controlled, the expression of a person receiving information that required immediate recalibration. She looked up. "Colonel Harker," she said, "we have a problem." James felt the floor change under him again. That particular sensation, familiar now, of the ground rearranging itself just when he'd found something that felt stable. "Victor Pren," Farrell said. "He left his residence approximately 2 hours ago. He has not reported to any of his known locations. His personal security detail has been stood down." She paused. "He's gone." The word "gone" sat in the room like something with physical weight. James watched Farrell's face as she processed whatever her phone was still feeding her, the tight economy of a senior officer absorbing bad information without broadcasting it, which was a skill he recognized because he'd spent 30 years developing it himself and knew what it looked like when it was working hard. She wasn't panicking, but she wasn't comfortable either, and the distance between those two states was doing a lot of work right now. "How long has he been off-grid?" James asked. "IG surveillance was passive. We weren't authorized for active monitoring until the duty officer call triggered the expanded scope." Farrell lowered her phone. His last confirmed location was his residence at 2 a.m. He had dinner with his wife, told her he had early calls, and was gone when she woke up at 5. "He knew," Claire said. She wasn't surprised. She said it the way a person stated the outcome of a calculation they'd already run. "When your duty officer call came in, Lena..." She looked at James. Captain Okafor's report would have moved through command channels. Pren has contacts inside those channels. He's had them for 14 years. "We're aware of the penetration concern," Farrell said, with the careful phrasing of someone confirming a thing without specifying what she knew about it. "Where does he go?" Marcus asked, from the doorway. He'd been standing there since Sloan came in, and James had the impression he'd positioned himself to cover the exit without making it obvious that he was covering the exit. Old habits. "If he's smart, he goes somewhere without extradition," Farrell said. "If he's arrogant, he goes somewhere he thinks his network can protect him." She paused. "Based on what I've read about Victor Pren, I would not rule out arrogant." Sloan, who had been standing very still in the corner of the room with the particular posture of a man who had realized that speaking was not helping him and had decided to stop, made a small sound. Not quite a laugh, something more contemptuous than that. "Something to add, Mr. Sloan?" Farrell said. "Victor doesn't run," Sloan said. His voice had changed. The negotiating register was gone, and what was left was something more genuine and less pleasant. "He's not going to a country without extradition. He has too much invested here, too many people who still owe him." He looked at Claire. "This isn't over because you're standing in a senator's office with a hard drive." "It's considerably further along than it was 3 hours ago," Claire said. "He has contingencies you don't know about, communications you haven't accessed. There are people in this room who work for him and don't know they work for him yet." Sloan said it not as a threat, but as information, the way a man delivered facts when he'd decided the game had changed and information was his last remaining currency. "I'm telling you this because I understand what my situation is. I'm not telling you this to help him." Farrell looked at him for a moment. "Is that an offer to cooperate?" "It's an acknowledgement of reality," Sloan said, "which I understand looks similar." Quant. The next 3 hours were the kind of hours that didn't feel like time passing. They felt like a series of rooms, each one more pressurized than the last, with different people asking variations of the same questions and the answers building into something that had structural weight. Patricia Lowe had the drive copied onto 3 separate encrypted devices within 40 minutes, 2 of which left the field office with IG escorts before 6 a.m. The original stayed with Lowe, who was working through the documentation with the focused velocity of a litigator who had been handed the case of her career and was burning clean on the adrenaline of it. She asked Claire precise, technical questions about chain of custody, access methodology, and the sourcing of each document type, and Claire answered them with the same precision, and James watched Lowe's notes accumulate and understood that what was being built in real time was not just evidence but a legal architecture, the framework for how this would hold up when Pren's lawyers tried to take it apart. Senator Vick made calls from his office with the door closed. James could hear the cadence of them through the wall, the particular rhythm of a senior legislator working the phone, short declarative exchanges, long listening silences, the efficient use of name and title that signaled calls going to specific people rather than staff. He didn't know who Vic was calling, and he didn't ask. That was above his lane, and he knew it. James himself sat at a desk in the outer office while Marissa Buell, who had apparently decided that her role tonight was logistical support across all categories, brought him coffee and re-examined the dressing on his incision with the expression of someone who had first aid training and strong opinions about wound management. "It's weeping," she said, meaning the incision. "I know. You need a doctor. I was in a hospital 12 hours ago. You need a different doctor." She pressed the dressing back into place with more firmness than strictly necessary. "When this is over." "When this is over," he agreed. Marcus had found a chair in the corner and was sitting in it with his arms folded and his eyes moving between the front door and the interior office, doing what James suspected he'd been doing in various forms for the past 7 years, covering exits, watching approaches, being the logistics of Claire's survival in the spaces where she couldn't cover everything herself. He'd said almost nothing since they arrived. He had the quality of a man who understood that his skills were physical and operational, and that the room they were in right now required different skills. And so he waited with the patience of someone who knew his moment wasn't this one. Claire stood at the window. She'd been there for 20 minutes, coffee untouched on the ledge beside her, watching the street in a way that was not surveillance exactly, more like the last application of a reflex that no longer had a specific target. The evidence was in Lowe's hands. The IG was engaged. Sloan was in a chair in the inner office being processed by a federal investigator who had arrived at 5:30 with the specific efficiency of someone who'd been briefed en route. The immediate threat had a name and a lawyer and was no longer in a position to make decisions. But Pren was gone, and that was the shape of the thing that wouldn't resolve. James crossed to the window and stood next to her. Not too close. She was occupying a specific internal space right now, and he could see it and didn't want to crowd it. "The financial records in the drive," he said. "The Harrow accounts. Are there routing trails?" "Yes." "Specific enough to track a transfer if he's moving money?" She looked at him sideways. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that a man who has been operating inside a financial network for 14 years doesn't disappear without moving assets first. And financial movement leaves traces that IG alone can access in under 6 hours if they know where to look." He paused. "Is there a specific institution in the Harrow financial documentation?" 3. 2 domestic, 1 offshore, Cayman-based shell, layered through a Luxembourg holding structure. She turned from the window fully now, and he could see the calculation running. The offshore structure has a routing signature. If he tries to consolidate or transfer through it, Farrell needs to know about that structure specifically, not the documentation generally, the specific routing signature and the offshore institution. Claire looked at him for another moment, then moved toward the inner office without another word. He followed her. The briefing with Farrell took 11 minutes. Farrell spent 7 of them on her phone after Claire finished, her voice low and precise. And when she hung up, she said, "Treasury's FinCEN unit is being contacted. If there's movement through that structure in the next 24 hours, they'll see it." "What's the realistic window?" James asked. "If he's trying to move before the investigation formally expands, today. Maybe tonight." Farrell looked at Claire. "Is there anything else in the drive that could indicate where he'd go physically? Properties, business relationships, anything that isn't already flagged in the Harrow contract documentation?" Claire thought for a moment. "There's a reference in the 2019 internal communications to a property in the Telford County area. It's listed as a corporate retreat, off the Harrow books, technically, owned through a subsidiary I didn't trace fully because it wasn't the primary thread I was following." Farrell wrote it down. Botan. At 8:15 a.m., the field office received a fax, an actual physical fax, which told James something about Senator Vick's staff and their systems, from the Joint Chiefs Legal Office, acknowledging the receipt of Colonel Harker's duty officer communication and formally requesting his presence at a secure briefing within 48 hours. The document had 3 senior signatures on it, and the specific kind of bureaucratic language that meant this had already moved several levels above where it had started. Marissa handed it to James without comment. He read it twice and set it on the desk. "That's movement," she said. "That's the beginning of movement," he said. "This takes months." "Everything takes months." She refilled his coffee. The indictment of a DoD contractor network, the reopening of KYA classifications, the review of sealed operational files, it all takes months. But it starts today. This morning. That's the part that matters right now. He looked at the facts and thought about the 16 months between the Koravan Mountains and this office, and the years before that, and the 14 years Claire had spent building something that could survive long enough to be received. And he didn't find what Marissa was saying insufficient exactly, but it had the texture of a thing that was easier to believe if you hadn't been inside the time it took. The door from the inner office opened, and Patricia Lowe came out with the particular walk of someone who had found something in the documentation that had just reorganized her understanding of the case. She stopped in front of James. "The Thomas Aldis cardiac event," she said. 2016. "I pulled the public record while we were working through the drive. The attending physician at his autopsy is listed as a doctor. Everett Horan." She held his gaze. "Dr. Horan holds a contract with a medical consulting group that is a second-tier subsidiary of Harrow Strategic Group. It's not in the drive. I found it in the contractor registry while I was cross-referencing." The room was quiet for a moment. "That's a third murder," James said. "That's a potential third murder, which becomes a prosecutorial matter once it's formally referred." Lowe said it steadily. "But it adds to the pattern of active suppression, and that pattern is now documented across 4 separate evidentiary threads. That's what changes the prosecution's posture from financial impropriety to a sustained criminal conspiracy with violence." She paused. "It also means the exposure for Pren is significantly higher than he may have calculated when he ran." "Or exactly as high as he calculated," Claire said, from the doorway of the inner office. Lowe looked at her. "Meaning?" "Meaning that a man who has managed this successfully for 14 years doesn't underestimate his exposure. He ran because he knows exactly what's in that drive and exactly what it builds to." Claire came fully into the outer office. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, something older and more tired than anger. "He's not panicking. He's executing a plan he's had in place for years. That's what Sloan told us. Victor doesn't run. But he has a version of running that doesn't look like running." "The property in Telford County," Marcus said. "Maybe. Or something else entirely that isn't in any documentation I have." She stopped in the center of the room. "I've been 2 steps behind Victor Pren for 14 years. I've had the evidence for most of that time, but I've never had the institutional reach to use it. Now I have the reach, but he has a head start." The front door of the field office opened. James turned, hand moving toward his side by reflex, before his brain caught up with the fact that he wasn't carrying anything. But it wasn't a threat. It was a woman in her early 40s in a federal agent's variant of business dress, badge visible, with the brisk certainty of someone who had driven here with purpose and arrived with more. "Supervisory Special Agent Diane Reyes," she said to the room. "FBI Public Corruption." Her eyes moved to Claire. "You're the source." "I thought your channel was compromised," Claire said. "Doran's devices were compromised. Doran didn't know me by name. He knew a contact number that routes to a clean cell I cycle every 90 days. Reyes held Claire's gaze. He was careful. He just didn't know how careful he needed to be. A pause that acknowledged what that meant without dwelling on it. "I got a call from IG 40 minutes ago. I've been briefed on the documentation. I'm here because Public Corruption has a concurrent open investigation into 3 of the contractors named in the Harrow network, and as of this morning, those investigations are being merged under a joint federal task force." The room was recalibrating around this. Lowe already moving toward Reyes with her legal pad, Farrell appearing in the inner office doorway. The machinery of official response was assembling itself in real time, which was what James had been trying to trigger for the past 8 hours. And it had the quality of something both necessary and slightly surreal. All this institutional weight that had been unavailable for 14 years. arriving now in a congressional field office at 8:30 in the morning because a colonel had made a phone call from a parking lot. Reyes crossed the room and stopped in front of Claire. "I want you to understand something," Reyes said, and her voice dropped slightly. Not soft, but direct in the way that excluded the rest of the room from the exchange. "Everything Doran told me about why this evidence hasn't moved through official channels, the monitoring, the penetration of IG and DOD, the risk to anyone who tried to carry this officially, I believed him. I couldn't confirm it, but I believed him. Now I have confirmation." She paused. "Major Donovan, you should have had this support years ago." Claire said nothing for a moment. She nodded, once, in the manner of someone who was receiving a thing they'd stopped expecting but hadn't stopped needing. "Pren is in the wind," James said to Reyes. "We know. His passport flagged at a private airfield 30 minutes ago. He boarded a chartered flight at 6:20 a.m. Reyes's voice was level. "The flight plan was filed for Cancun. We have Interpol notification in progress and a State Department advisory on his passport. He won't land somewhere that ignores it." "Will he land somewhere that slows it down enough to matter?" Marcus asked. "That's the variable," Reyes admitted. "But we have his financial network flagged, his travel documents flagged, and now we have 4 hours of deposition ahead of us that will produce an arrest warrant package before noon." She looked at Claire. "The warrant package is the thing that travels. Cancun or anywhere else." The depositions were not dramatic. They were long and methodical and physically uncomfortable in the way that ours in institutional chairs tended to be. And James's incision made its presence known throughout, with consistent and creative specificity. Claire sat across from Reyes and Lowe and 2 additional federal attorneys who arrived at 9 a.m., and she answered questions for 4 hours with the same precision and the same absence of performance that she'd brought to everything else. And James sat in the outer office and gave his own statement to a different attorney and watched the field office fill incrementally with people who had been doing adjacent work for years without the full picture. The full picture, assembled in real time from Claire's documentation and Sloane's grudging partial cooperation and the cross-referenced records that Lowe and Reyes's teams were pulling from concurrent investigations, was larger than James had understood from inside the hospital room, and larger than Claire had been able to see from her particular vantage point. The weapons network that Greywire was supposed to disrupt had been active for 19 years. It had operated through 7 different contracting entities, 3 of which were still holding active DoD contracts. Victor Pren had been one of 4 principals. 2 of the others were still in government-adjacent positions, and the 4th had died of natural causes in 2021, or what was on record as natural causes. The numbers involved were not abstract. There were dollar amounts that implied systematic corruption at a scale that required sustained protection at multiple levels, and the protection had been there, and it had worked, and Claire Dolan had been living inside the consequence of that working for 14 years. At 1:15 p.m., Patricia Lowe came out of the inner office and said, to the room, "The arrest warrant for Victor Pren has been issued, federal, under seal, transmitted to Interpol and state." Marcus, who had not left his chair in the corner in approximately 6 hours except to get coffee, said, "Good." James was watching the inner office door for Claire. She came out 5 minutes after Lowe, and she looked like a person who had been doing something physically demanding for a long time. Not destroyed, but used. She had the particular quality of someone in the aftermath of sustained effort, not relief and not triumph, just the adjustment to a new state of things. She crossed to the window again. Old reflex. James joined her. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me when I've slept." It was the most honest answer she'd given him that wasn't about the mission, and he appreciated it. "Sloane," he said. "Is he cooperating?" "Selectively. He's calculating what cooperation buys him against what exposure costs him, and that calculation is going to take the next 6 months of his attorney's time to resolve." She looked at the street. He confirmed the Aldi's death wasn't natural. He confirmed Pren authorized it. He's not going to sign anything that puts him in the room for that decision, but he confirmed it. That's enough to get a warrant for Horan. Reyes already has one. A pause. Dr. Horan surrendered to federal agents at his home office 40 minutes ago. He apparently had a lawyer on standby. He knew it was coming. He He's known it was coming for years, Claire said. People who do what he did always know it's coming. They just calculate that it won't come while they're still useful. Outside, the afternoon light was doing something specific to the street, a late autumn angle that made everything look simultaneously ordinary and momentarily precise, the kind of light that paid equal attention to everything. Traffic moved. People walked past without any awareness of what the building behind them had contained since 4 in the morning. James's phone, his real phone, retrieved from the field office fax line's secure messaging function by Marissa at some point, showed 17 missed calls and 43 messages, which was what happened when a colonel went off-grid during an active IG investigation with a duty officer flag on his file. He'd deal with those later. He was dealing with them specifically by looking at the number and putting the phone back in his pocket. "The surviving soldiers from Greywire," he said. "The ones you've been protecting. There are 2 left, besides Marcus." She said it without looking at him. "The 3rd died in 2020, medical, genuine." A breath. Reyes is coordinating contact with them through channels that aren't connected to anything Sloan or Pren had visibility on. They'll be brought into the formal investigation. Their names, their service records, will be reviewed as part of the KIA reclassification process that Farrell's office is initiating. She paused. "That process is slow." "I know. It could take a year longer." "I know," he said again. "It'll happen." She turned from the window to look at him, and whatever she was reading in his face she apparently found sufficient because she nodded and turned back. At 3:45 p.m., Reyes appeared in the doorway with her phone in her hand and an expression that was disciplined but not entirely neutral. "Pren's flight diverted," she said. "Mechanical issue filed with the charter company. They landed at a private strip in western Georgia. The country, not the state, about 90 minutes ago." "That's not a mechanical issue," Marcus said. "No," Reyes agreed. "Georgian authorities have been contacted. There's a mutual legal assistance treaty, but the application is going to take days," James said. "Days at minimum, weeks realistically." Reyes's voice was controlled. "We have the warrant package. We have the treaty request in motion. We have his financial network being actively closed by FinCEN as of 2 hours ago. His offshore access has been frozen." She paused. "He's in Georgia with whatever he traveled with. No access to his money, no travel documents that any cooperating country will honor, and an Interpol red notice that's being circulated as we speak. He can stay comfortable for a few days. After that, the calculation changes." "What if Georgia doesn't cooperate?" Marcus asked. "Georgia has defense cooperation agreements with the United States that create more discomfort than they're going to want to absorb over one man." Reyes said it with the measured certainty of someone who'd worked international enforcement long enough to understand the leverage. He knows that. That's why he's not in a country that makes this cleaner. A country that makes it cleaner would be an obvious move, and obvious moves get intercepted faster. "He's buying time," Claire said. "Yes." "For what?" Reyes was quiet for a moment. "That's the question I've been working on since his passport flagged." She looked at Claire directly. "Is there anything in the documentation, anything you didn't include because it wasn't the primary evidentiary thread, that suggests a fallback position, assets, people, anything that would give him leverage rather than escape?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She was very still, the specific stillness James had learned to read. Not absence, but high-speed internal process. "There's one name," she said slowly, "in the 2019 communications. A reference, single mention, no context, no title. I didn't trace it because it appeared adjacent to the property reference, and I was following the financial thread." She stopped. "The name is Beaumont." Reyes's expression shifted. Subtly, but James caught it. "You know that name," he said to her. Reyes took a breath. "Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Alan Beaumont. He retired 14 months ago." She set her phone down on the desk with the careful movement of someone managing their response. "He is currently a senior fellow at the Keller Institute for Strategic Policy." "Which is funded by," Patricia Lowe said, from across the room, already on her tablet, a foundation whose primary donors include Harrow Strategic Group, Reyes finished. The room was quiet. He's not buying time to run, Claire said. He's buying time to activate Beaumont, someone still inside the policy infrastructure who can apply pressure to the treaty process, to the FinCEN action, to the warrant package. Beaumont doesn't have the clearance for that anymore, Farrell said. He's retired. He doesn't need clearance, James said. He needs relationships. And a man who spent 22 years in DoD acquisition policy has relationships. He looked at Reyes. How fast can you move on Beaumont? Reyes already had her phone in her hand. Faster than he can make a call, she said, and stepped out of the room. The outer office settled into the particular tension of people waiting for a process to execute, each of them sitting with the knowledge that the architecture of the case was solid and the arrest warrant existed and the evidence was in federal hands. And all of that was true and real, and still might not be sufficient if Victor Pren had one functional relationship inside the right office that could delay things long enough for him to find a third option. James looked at Claire. She was looking at the fax machine, which had just begun to print something. Marissa moving toward it automatically, tearing the page free, scanning it, her face changing in the particular way of someone reading a thing that reorganized their immediate understanding of the situation. She handed it to James without speaking. It was a message from Lena Okafor, relayed through the Joint Chiefs Duty Officer system, time-stamped 11 minutes ago. Colonel Harker, be advised. Captain Torres, Ward 7, Blackthorn Military Medical Center, has been taken into voluntary protective custody by base security at 14:30 hours following an attempted contact by an individual claiming to be DoD security. Individual presented credentials subsequently identified as fraudulent. Individual left the building before security arrived. Description matched to Harrow Strategic Group field operative per IG database. Okafor. James read it twice. Torres, the day nurse. The young man with the earnest energy who had told him about Nurse Voss's ward reassignment, who had been at the nurse's station when they'd moved through the corridor, who had no conceivable connection to anything in this room except proximity to the two people Pren wanted most. He's building leverage, James said. Not escape and not obstruction. Leverage. Claire looked at the facts. Someone is trying to find something to hold over us, she said. Anyone who knows us, anyone who can be connected to us and used as... She stopped. Her expression changed. Not slowly, fast and total, the look of a person arriving at a conclusion that had been sitting in plain sight and had just become visible. Marcus, she said, and her voice was different now, stripped even of the controlled professional register, just a voice, urgent and stripped down. When did you last hear from your daughter? Marcus came out of his chair. This morning, he said. 7, before we... He already had his phone out. She's at school. She should be... He dialed. They all heard it ring. Ring again, 4 times. 5. Voicemail. Marcus dialed a second number. His hand was steady, but his face was not. And James understood in that moment that Marcus Webb had spent 7 years as the logistics of someone else's survival and had managed, across all of that, to build something small and ordinary and completely separate from all of it. And the name of that thing was a daughter who was currently not answering her phone. The voicemail picked up a second time. Her name, Claire said very quietly. What's her name? Kayla, Marcus said. She's 17. Reyes came back through the door at exactly that moment, phone in hand, and read the room in the half-second professionals used for that purpose, and said, What happened? Marcus was already moving toward the door. Reyes had her phone out before Marcus reached the door. Stop, she said. And the word had enough authority in it that Marcus stopped, not because he wanted to, but because some part of him that had operated in structured environments long enough recognized command when it came without volume. If someone has your daughter, you driving to her school alone is exactly what they want. They want you isolated and reactive. She was already dialing. Where does she go? Eastfield High. It's 20 minutes from... I have a field agent, 4 minutes from Eastfield High. Reyes had the phone to her ear. Let me get eyes on her before you move. 60 seconds. Marcus stood in the middle of the room with his car keys in his hand and the specific contained quality of a man running every calculation available to him and arriving at the same answer each time, which was that Reyes was right, and he hated that she was right, and 60 seconds was 60 seconds. The call lasted 45 of them. "She's in class," Reyes said, lowering the phone. "My agent can see her through the classroom window. She's fine. Her phone is probably in her locker. Schools are enforcing no phone policies more strictly this semester." Marcus let out a breath that wasn't quite steady. "I want someone with her," he said. "My agent will stay on the building until I say otherwise." Reyes looked at him directly. "Your daughter is safe, but this tells us something. They went looking for leverage and they found a wall. Your operational security held." She said it without making it a compliment, just a statement of outcome, which was the right register for a man who didn't need to be praised for protecting his kid, but needed to know she was okay. "Torres," James said, "the nurse at Blackthorn. Base security has him. He's fine." Reyes moved back toward the center of the room. "What this tells us is that Pren is actively trying to build a position, not escape, like Claire said. He's looking for something to trade. That means he's not running. He's negotiating from a position he thinks he still has." She paused. "Which means he doesn't know yet that Beaumont is in play." "What did you get on Beaumont?" Claire asked. "FBI field office in D.C. had eyes on him within 20 minutes of my call. He's at his home in Arlington. As of 40 minutes ago, he made 3 outgoing calls. We don't have content yet. We need a warrant for intercept, which is in process. And received 1 incoming call from an international number that routes through a Tbilisi exchange." "Pren," James said. "Almost certainly." Reyes set her phone down on the desk. "We have the warrant request moving through a federal magistrate right now. The argument for exigency is strong. Ongoing conspiracy, active flight, attempted witness intimidation." She looked at her watch. 2 hours, maybe less. 2 hours was 2 hours. In 2 hours, Pren could make enough calls through Beaumont to complicate 3 different parts of the case simultaneously. Not destroy it, the evidence was too well documented and too widely held for that now, but complicate it in ways that would cost months and give his attorneys room to work. James looked at Claire. She was already thinking the same thing. He could tell. The particular expression of a person running a problem that didn't have a clean solution and was making peace with that. This was what he'd seen her do across the entire night, the willingness to accept imperfect options and work with what was actually available rather than what should be available. "The Beaumont calls," she said to Reyes. "You can't intercept them yet. But Beaumont doesn't know that." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "Walk me through what you're thinking," she said. "If Beaumont receives a visit from federal agents before the intercept warrant comes through, not an arrest, not an interrogation, just a presence, he'll stop making calls. He doesn't know what you have. He doesn't know what Sloan has said. A man in his position with that much exposure will default to silence the moment he sees a badge at his door." Claire paused. Silence is not as good as intercept, but silence stops the calls to Georgia. Reyes considered this for approximately 4 seconds. "It's not standard procedure." "No," Claire said. Another 2 seconds. "It's not inadmissible either. A voluntary contact is a voluntary contact." She picked up her phone. "I need to be careful about how I word this." She stepped out again. James sat down because his incision was delivering a sustained argument that he had been ignoring for hours, and it was becoming harder to ignore. Marcus had moved back to his corner chair and was looking at his phone, which presumably showed his daughter's name, and the way he was looking at it had the quality of something private that James didn't focus on. Senator Vick came out of his office for the first time since the deposition started, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had been absorbing briefings for hours and had arrived somewhere in his thinking. He looked at Claire. "Major Donovan," he said, using the rank, the real rank, not the name on the night shift badge. It was the first time anyone except Farrell had used it, and the effect was visible. Not dramatic, just a small correction to the record, delivered in the middle of a congressional field office that had a weight out of proportion to the words. "I want you to know that as of this morning, I've initiated a formal request to the Senate Armed Services Committee for a classified hearing on Operation Graywire and the associated contractor network. The hearing is not contingent on the criminal proceedings. It runs concurrent." "That could compromise the prosecution," Claire said. "The classified hearing will be coordinated with the Justice Department to avoid that." He wasn't dismissive of the concern. He acknowledged it and moved past it. What I need you to understand is that the criminal case moves at the speed of the courts. The oversight process moves at the speed of the legislature. Neither one is fast, but they move together, and together they're harder to obstruct than either one alone. He paused. You've been carrying this without institutional support for 14 years. The institution is slower than you needed it to be. I'm not going to tell you that's acceptable, but it's here now. Claire looked at him for a moment. What do you need from me? I need you to be willing to testify, publicly, eventually, when the criminal proceedings permit it. Not now. Now I need you rested and supported and working with federal counsel. He said it practically, not solemnly. The story of what happened in those mountains needs to be on the public record, not as a classified footnote. On the record. Claire said, yes, without hesitating, and James heard in that single word the entire weight of 14 years of a person waiting for someone with the right authority to ask the right question. Reyes came back at 5:20 p.m. Beaumont stopped making calls 40 minutes ago, she said. 2 of my agents knocked on his door in Arlington and identified themselves. They told him they were there to inform him that he might be contacted by individuals seeking information about former DoD personnel, and that if he received such contact, he should notify the FBI immediately. She allowed herself a small, controlled expression that was close to satisfaction. He said he understood. He's been on his home landline twice since then, both calls to his personal attorney. Pren can't reach him anymore, James said. Not through Beaumont. Reyes sat down for the first time in hours. She looked tired, the specific tiredness of someone running on professional momentum and feeling the edge of it. The intercept warrant came through at 4:55. We have content on the earlier calls. Beaumont was trying to reach 2 former colleagues in the DoD legal counsel's office to apply pressure on the treaty request processing. Neither of them called him back. She paused. Which suggests they already knew which way this was going and made their calculation accordingly. Rats, Marcus said from his corner. People managing their exposure, Reyes said, which was a more charitable framing but meant the same thing. The Pren warrant was formally transmitted to Georgian authorities at 6:10 p.m. with the intercept content as supplementary documentation. Reyes coordinated the transmission personally, working with a State Department attaché who had been looped in through channels James didn't entirely follow. And the combination of the financial freeze documentation, the warrant package, the Interpol notice, and now the content of Pren's calls to Beaumont, calls that demonstrated active obstruction of a federal investigation while on foreign soil, produced the kind of treaty request that Georgian authorities found difficult to defer on without creating bilateral problems they didn't want. James knew this because Reyes' side of the coordination call was audible from the outer office, and he'd spent 30 years learning to read the shape of negotiations from one side of the exchange. At 8:45 p.m., Georgian authorities confirmed that Victor Pren had been taken into custody at a private residence outside Tbilisi, pending extradition proceedings. Reyes came out and said it in the same even voice she'd used for everything else, and the room received it in the way people receive things they'd been working toward for a long time. Not with celebration, because celebration required a kind of lightness that didn't fit the accumulated weight of what the day had been, but with the specific quality of a thing landing that was supposed to land. Marcus put his phone in his pocket. Claire sat down. James looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at his hands, and then at the window, where the night had fully established itself, and felt something in his chest that he couldn't precisely name. Not relief, because relief implied the end of something, and this was not the end of anything. The proceedings would take the time they took. The hearings would take the time they took. Pren's extradition would move through its process, and his attorneys were already working, and Sloan's cooperation would be negotiated and renegotiated over months. None of this was resolved in any final sense, but it was no longer hidden. That was the thing. The specific thing that had changed in one night in ways that 14 years of Claire's careful work had not been able to change. It was no longer hidden. No. The months that followed did not move fast. James had expected that intellectually, but experienced it in the body, in the particular grinding patience required to participate in a legal process that moved in the time signature of institutions rather than people. He gave testimony in 4 separate proceedings. He submitted written statements to 2 Senate committees. He sat in rooms with federal attorneys for more collective hours than he wanted to count, going over the same documents with the same precision, building the same evidentiary architecture from slightly different angles each time. His incision healed. He went back on active duty status in a limited capacity while the proceedings were ongoing, which was a bureaucratic accommodation he hadn't expected and which cost someone somewhere significant political effort to arrange. He suspected Senator Vic. He didn't ask. Victor Pren was extradited from Georgia 11 weeks after his arrest there. The process had been slower than Reyes's most optimistic projection, complicated by one Georgian official who had relationships with the Harrow network that took 3 weeks to document and route around. When Pren arrived on American soil, he was met by federal marshals, arraigned within 48 hours, and denied bail on the grounds of demonstrated flight risk. His legal team was large and expensive, and immediately began constructing the argument that the evidence against him had been obtained through unauthorized access and should be suppressed. The suppression argument failed in February. The judge's ruling was 47 pages and addressed each evidentiary thread separately, finding that the materials obtained during Claire's initial network access 16 years ago had been accessed under her legitimate operational clearance at the time, that the subsequent documentation she'd gathered post-disappearance was admissible under a whistleblower protection analysis that Lowe had constructed with considerable care, and that the intercept content obtained by Reyes' office was clean. All of it stood. James read the ruling in his office at 6 a.m. the day it was released. He called Claire. She answered on the 3rd ring, which meant she'd been awake. "I know," she said when he started to speak. "I thought you'd want to hear it from—" "I already read it." A pause. "All 47 pages." "Of course you did." He set the ruling down on his desk. "How are you?" A silence that was longer than her usual silences. "I slept last night," she said. "Properly. First time in—" She stopped. "A long time." He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed to be said into that particular silence. The public hearings before the Senate Armed Services Committee began in March. James testified on the 4th day. He sat in front of the committee in his dress uniform and gave a statement that he had written himself over 3 evenings, refusing Lena's offer to help draft it because some things needed to come out in a person's own words or they didn't come out right. He described Operation Graywire as he had experienced it. He described the 16 months between the Corrivan Mountains and Blackthorn Military Medical Center. He described finding a woman he'd believed dead for 14 years standing at his IV pole at 3 a.m., and what she'd said and what he'd done with it. He described his own 16 months of not looking at a sealed file and called it what it was, a decision made out of professional self-preservation dressed up as deference to institutional process. The committee room was quiet while he spoke. The cameras were on. He had stopped performing for cameras somewhere around his 3rd decade in uniform, and what came out in the hearing room was simply what he knew and what he'd done and what he hadn't done, in the order it had happened, without the language of spin or mitigation. He was asked, on cross-examination by the committee's ranking member, whether he believed the military's internal oversight mechanisms had failed. "Yes," he said. "Completely and for a long time. The failure wasn't accidental. It was maintained. That's the distinction I'd asked the committee to keep in front of them." Claire testified a week later. James was in the room for it, in the public gallery, at her request. She'd asked him to be there in a text message that said, simply, "Will you come?" and he'd said yes without asking why. Because he understood why. She came in civilian clothes and sat in the witness chair, and for the first hour of her testimony, she was the same Claire Dolan he'd watched work through 4 months of legal proceedings. Precise, unemotional in the sense of controlled, laying out 14 years of documentation with the methodical clarity of someone who had organized this information in her mind so many times that it had the texture of known geography. The second hour was different. The committee's questions moved from the evidence to the experience, and Claire moved with them, and what came out was not the tactical account but the human one. The years of nursing school while carrying a drive that could have changed everything, the ward shifts and the patient charts and the work she'd done that was real, Even inside a life she'd built as a cover, the moment she'd heard James say a mission name in the dark and done the math on what it meant and decided anyway. She spoke about Marcus and the others. She spoke about Thomas Aldous. She said his name clearly, on the public record, in a Senate hearing room so that it was there permanently in a way that couldn't be sealed. She did not perform any of it. She did not make it bigger than it was or smaller than it was. She spoke about 14 years the way a person spoke about 14 years. Not as a story with a clean arc, but as time that had been lived inside, some of it barely, all of it at a cost she hadn't finished calculating. When the committee chair thanked her for her testimony, she nodded and gathered her papers and stood. And the room, the public gallery, the press section, the staff along the walls, was quiet in a way that galleries were not usually quiet, the specific silence of a large number of people who had just received something they hadn't known they needed. The verdicts came in stages across the following months. Garrett Sloan, under his cooperation agreement, pleaded guilty to 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of unlawful participation in a prohibited foreign financial transaction. The agreement reduced his exposure from a potential life sentence to a mandatory minimum of 22 years. His attorneys argued for the lower end. The judge sentenced him to 26, citing the premeditated nature of the Corvin targeting and his role in the subsequent 14 years of active suppression. Dr. Everett Horan, whose attorney had been on standby for a reason, negotiated a plea on a single count of conspiracy after the forensic autopsy of Thomas Aldous produced findings inconsistent with natural cardiac death. He received 9 years. 3 former DoD officials connected to the Harrow Acquisition Network were indicted in April, arraigned in May, and variously pleaded or went to trial across the remainder of the year. The trials were not quick. 2 resulted in guilty verdicts on the primary charges. The 3rd ended in a hung jury on the most serious count, with conviction on 2 lesser charges. None of them walked away clean. Victor Pren went to trial in the fall. He had the best defense team money could build, and they were good. Technically proficient, strategically aggressive, working every evidentiary angle that the suppression ruling had left them. The trial lasted 6 weeks. James attended 4 days of it. Claire attended every day in the public gallery, in the same row each morning, watching the proceedings with the same expression she used for everything, controlled, direct, giving nothing away that she hadn't decided to give. The jury deliberated for 9 days, which was long enough that James began to feel the particular anxiety of a thing that had moved correctly through every step and might still, somehow, come apart at the last one. He did not share this with Claire. She probably felt it too, but she sat in the row each morning without showing it, and he followed her lead. On the 9th day, the jury returned. Guilty on all 12 counts. The counts included conspiracy to commit murder of federal personnel, illegal weapons trafficking facilitation, obstruction of justice, abuse of official position, and 4 counts specific to the financial network that had been running through Harrow and its subsidiaries for 19 years. The judge set sentencing for 8 weeks out. When the sentencing came, it was the maximum the guidelines permitted on each count, structured to run consecutively rather than concurrently. Victor Pren, who had stood throughout the verdict reading with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 50 years not showing what he felt in rooms where it cost him, sat down when the sentencing was delivered. Not dramatically, just the ordinary physical response of a body absorbing something large. His lead attorney put a hand briefly on his shoulder and said something James couldn't hear from the gallery. Pren didn't respond. James looked at Claire, 1 row ahead of him and to the left. She was looking at the front of the courtroom. Her hands were flat on her knees. Whatever she was feeling in that moment was hers, and he didn't try to read it. The KIA reclassifications took 14 months. The process was exactly as bureaucratically slow as Farrell had indicated it would be. Moving through military records review, legal certification, formal notification procedures, and the particular careful work of correcting documents that had been deliberately falsified rather than simply wrong. Each step required sign-off from multiple offices and the coordination of Farrell's IG team with the Army's Personnel Command and the JAG office, and 2 congressional oversight bodies that wanted to be on record as participating in the correction. Marcus Webb's service record was amended first, because his circumstances were the most straightforwardly corrected. A living soldier whose post-mission documentation had been managed to ensure his silence rather than distorted to misrepresent his death. The amendment restored 2 commendations that had been omitted from his official record in what the reviewing officer noted in official language as an irregularity inconsistent with documented performance. Marcus read the amended record in a federal building downtown, sitting across from a uniformed Army records officer who had been assigned to the case and had clearly read enough of it to understand what he was participating in. The officer was professional throughout. When Marcus stood to leave, the officer stood too and offered his hand and said, "Thank you for your service, Staff Sergeant," in the particular way people said it when they actually meant the specific thing rather than the reflexive version. Marcus shook his hand and left and called his daughter from the parking lot and told her he was going to be late for dinner. Claire Donovan's reclassification was more complex and took 4 months longer. The restoration of a KYA classification to living status required documentation that the original classification had been fraudulent rather than erroneous, which in turn required the legal finding from the criminal proceedings to be formally incorporated into the military records process. A linkage that Farrell's office navigated with the patience of people who had decided to do this correctly rather than quickly. When it was done, Major Claire Donovan was officially restored to active duty status in the Army records system, with her service history intact, her rank confirmed, and a commendation for actions in the Coravon Range added to her file based on the after-action reconstruction that the IG's investigation had produced. She was offered a return to service. She thought about it for 3 weeks. James knew she was thinking about it because she didn't mention it, and the things Claire didn't mention were the things she was actually working through. He didn't push. He had his own things he was working through, and he'd learned that the most respectful thing he could do with another person's process was not insert himself into it. She called him on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. "I'm not going back," she said. "Okay. I want to be clear that it's not because I'm done. It's because I've been a nurse for 9 years and the work is real and the people are real and I'm good at it." A pause. "I'm going to finish what I started at Blackthorn. Properly, this time. Under my own name." "Major Donovan, RN," he said. Something like that. Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite lightness but was adjacent to it. The sound of a person who had put down something very heavy and was discovering what their own voice sounded like without the weight. "I'm also going to consult. For the IG's office, for the committee. There are other cases, other people inside systems that are doing what Graywire did. I know how to find the threads. Of course you do. Don't make that sound like a compliment. It is a compliment." A brief silence. "How's the incision?" "Healed," he said. "Months ago." "Good." Another pause, smaller. "James, thank you for not letting it go." He thought about the 16 months before Blackthorn. The sealed file he hadn't touched. The names he'd told himself were properly classified, properly managed, properly closed. He thought about what it cost a person to make themselves invisible for 14 years while carrying the weight of what they knew, and the specific luck of a night shift rotation that had put her in his room, and the specific stubbornness that had made him pursue it rather than accept the rational explanation and go back to sleep. "I almost let it go," he said. "But you didn't." "No," he said. "I didn't." That was all it needed to be. Walk.